Good morning, Wabash. Today's speaker attended Wabash on one of the last full Oregon scholarships during a period in which chapel was mandatory and too many absences meant expulsion from the college. After graduating in 1970, he continued his education at the University of Chicago, where he obtained his master's and then his PhD in 1988. He's in the midst of his fourth stint teaching here at Wabash, the first three of which were during the late 80s and early to mid 90s. He's also taught at what some consider the only other true all-male college in the U.S., which is Hampton-Sydney College. Dr. Blix takes an avid interest in everything Wabash, attending faculty dinners, numerous seminars around campus, and of course he's always available to play the organ whenever needed here in the chapel. In 2005, he was named a Carnegie Scholar, and he was one of 21 teachers nationwide that was named that year. Later that spring in 2006, he received the McLean, McTurnan, Arnold Excellence in Teaching Award, which he says means that he got to send out 3 thank yous instead of just 1 afterwards. So please help me in welcoming Dr. Blix as he gives the first in a series of 4 chapel talks commemorating the 175th year of Wabash, titled, "That Was Then, This Is Now."
A few weeks ago now, Kyle came by my office and asked if I could give a chapel talk this semester. I hesitated. They explained. They explained that this academic year, 2007-08, was going to be a celebration of the 175th anniversary of the founding of the college. Some of the chapel talks this year were supposed to be part of that celebration. And could I give one of those talks? I was flattered. "What did you have in mind?" I asked. "Oh, we'd like you to talk about student life when you were here at the college in the late 1950s. "The late 1950s, I said. "You mean the late 1960s? "Oh, yeah, that's what we meant." I then said I needed to be upfront with them. "I might not be the best person to give this talk," I said. "Why?" they said. "Because," I said, when I was at the college in the late 1960s, I was a complete and total nerd." "Oh," they said. That's okay. So we struck our bargain. Here I am. In all fairness, I should add that they didn't actually say the late 1950s. I made that up. But it does capture how much this exercise makes me feel venerable. So, with all due allowance for my collegiate nerdiness or nerdhood, I would like to talk to you this morning about what it was like to be a student at Wabash in the late 1960s. More precisely, I would like to talk to you about what it was like to be a student from 1966, when I entered Wabash as a freshman, to 1970, when I was graduated. Now, an aside. The word nerd. When I say nerd, I mean simply that I was quiet, shy, and found it hard to talk to people. I was very serious. I studied all the time. I never listened to popular music except maybe Simon and Garfunkel. I listened only to classical music. I did not swear. I did not party. I did not drink. In fact, the first real drink I ever had was in the second semester of my senior year. I was on a Glee Club trip. I had a daiquiri before dinner, and it damn near put me under the table. Anyway, I'd like to do this in two parts. First, I'd like to talk about some experiences that I had in common with other students. And then second, I'd like to talk about some experience that happened to me specifically, at least as far as I know. I tell these stories in the spirit of a guy who was a student at the college in my day, who used to live in Martindale Hall on the 4th floor. He was, if I remember correctly, he was a religion major and a very funny guy. In the spring, it was his custom to fill his wastebasket with water. He would then station himself by his window and wait for some unsuspecting wretch to pass beneath it below. From 4 stories up, he'd stick the wastebasket out the window and pour the water on the student whilst crying at the top of his lungs, "Repent and be baptized." He is now a minister. So here's a deluge of stories to baptize you with. First then, what was it like to be a student in general in the late 1960s? Let me begin with my freshman year. In particular, let me begin with that aspect of the freshman year which had very little to do with academics in the classroom and a lot to do with what was then called freshman indoctrination. As some of you may know, back in the late 1960s, the college had in place a program called freshman orientation or freshman indoctrination. This program applied to all freshmen, independents as well as students in fraternities. The spirit of this freshman indoctrination program is captured in the famous poster listing the old rules, which is now a t-shirt and which begins with the words, "Rhineys, read, and reading tremble." In case you're not familiar with this literary masterpiece, let me share a few delectable lines. This is the copy from the wall in the dean's office. It's long. "Rhineys, read, and reading tremble." Now this is a later version. The original would have said the senior council. "We, the senior council, lay down the following few enlightened rules, which you numbed numbskulls, you lame brains, you swinish mattoids, you pregnant puppies, you damned hicks from the small town, will probably be unable to comprehend, but which you must obey to the letter, lest you taste a fate worse than death, utter ignominy, or ignominy, however, I've never known how to pronounce that word, the fruits of defiance and the wrath of the all-powerful. For instance, hearken, you garrulous goats, dare not to wear sweaters or clothes that resemble in color the scarlet worn by the W men. Hearken, do not let your repulsive mouths hang open, and keep your scruffy tongues from wagging overmuch at any time. Hearken, you slimy, shivering, spoiled, shaggy gobs of spittle, that you do not approach even into proximity with the hallowed roost of the junior class, the almighty fence. I have no idea what the almighty fence was, but we were scared of it. Hearken, you wizened, rimless zeros. You are not in your worthless high schools any longer, and that the time has come to grow up if such a feat is possible at all, you scums. What did this mean in practice? Well, a whole bunch of things. Let me just go down the list in no particular order. This is fun stuff to tell. All freshmen wore hats called pots. These were green beanies with red brims and red buttons on the top, much like what the Phi Delts wear now. All freshmen were supposed to tip their pots to 4 groups of people. All faculty members, all members of the senior council, all women, and all visitors on campus. Of course, when you came out of class and had to cross campus, you had no idea at that point of who was who. So, at any given hour, you had troops of freshmen wigging their pots up and down from one end of the mall to the other like caps flipping off of beer bottles on a Saturday night. While freshmen were wearing the pots, the upperclassmen were free to engage in a form of capture the flag. Upperclassmen were at liberty to chase you, tackle you, seize your pot, rip it up, and hand it back to you, leaving you to wear it in that state. Freshmen were not allowed to sit at the round tables in the Scarlet Inn, lest they pollute the college seal, which in those days was embossed on the back of the chairs. Freshmen were not allowed to walk on the college seal, which was laid in linoleum in the floor of the front entrance of Lilly Library. Actually, nobody was supposed to walk on it, not just freshmen. I might note there's carpet there now, a little past where the security gates are, and I've often wondered if the seal is still there underneath it. Freshmen could enter or leave the chapel only by the side doors. There used to be a door to the chapel over here. And this was important because in those days, as Kyle just said, we had required chapel twice a week, once on Monday and once on Thursday. You had an assigned seat. All freshmen sat in the balcony. All sophomores sat at the back of the main floor. All juniors sat in the middle, and all seniors sat up front. All of the faculty sat in that part of the balcony up there. Attendance was required, and attendance was taken. You were allowed 10 cuts. If you missed more than 10, you were expelled from the college, no questions asked. It goes without saying, of course, that all the freshmen had to learn alma mater and Old Wabash. There were 2 chapel sings, as we termed them then. They were much like what we have now, except that the alma mater took place outside rather than inside. And of course, as I suppose everybody knows, if you messed up in the end, you received not a red W on a t-shirt, but a W haircut on your head. As for other infractions, if, for instance, you walked on the college seal or failed to tip your pot, you were summoned before the senior council. For the first offense, if I remember correctly, you were given a warning. For the second, you had to wear bright green long johns over your clothes for a week. And for a third infraction, you also received the W haircut. Finally, I ought to mention the legendary event known as the pole fight. This took place just before Thanksgiving. There was a tall pole that used to stand just west of the plant near the east end of the football field. In this event, a pot was placed on top of the pole, and the pole was slathered with grease. The sophomores gathered around the foot of the pole to defend it. The freshmen gathered some distance away in an attempt to conquer it. They were allowed 3 charges. That is, they could charge 3 times, attempt to clamber over the writhing mass of sophomores, whose arms reached up, Scylla-like, to drag you down into the well-churned mud, and then you would climb up the pole and seize the pot. If the freshmen did this, and if certain other conditions were met, the entire freshman indoctrination program ended then and there. If the freshmen failed, and they usually did, the program remained in effect until the end of the semester. Now, all of this was one set of experiences that freshmen went through. I'll come back to it a little later. There were other experiences of a more academic nature. Sometimes when students and I talk today, and they hear stories of the pole fight, they say, "Oh, wow, it would be so nice to bring that tradition back." I, of course, then mentioned that the pole fight was eventually discontinued because of broken arms and legs. But I also like to point out that if you want to bring back one tradition from the 1960s, you need to bring back others. For instance, I sometimes hear students today complain about having to attend classes at 8 o'clock in the morning. Oh, what squishy, weak-kneed, pusillanimous whining this is. And gentlemen, in our day, when men were men. And Dean Bambry can attest to this. The earliest classes began not at 8:30, nor even at 8 o'clock. They began at 7:50 a.m. (7:50 a.m.) And in addition to that, classes did not meet 5 times a week. They met 6 times a week: Monday, Wednesday, Friday, and then again Tuesday, Thursday, Saturday. What about courses? It's interesting to recall, especially in light of our current discussions of the curriculum, that in the late 1960s, all students were required to take not only 2 full years of foreign language, but also 1 semester of mathematics and 2 full years of lab science. Not 2 semesters, 2 full years. And these courses were specified. You took a full year of general biology, and there was no distinction made between Bio 101 and Bio 111. Everybody took the same course. You also had to take a year-long course called Physics Chemistry, or Phys Chem for short. Now, while we were students, the physics and chemistry faculty did finally yield to the times and created 2 different Phys Chem courses. There was the real Phys Chem 1-2, for science people, and that met at 7:50 in the morning, Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. And then there was Phys Chem for poets, or Phys Chem 1A, 2A, which met at a more civilized time. What about the biology department? My friends, the biology department did not cave. They retained a spine of iron, and it was a long, long time before they moved to something like the present arrangement, and certainly long after my classmates and I had graduated in 1970. Such then were some of the common experiences that all students at Wabash underwent in the late 1960s. But what about personal experiences specific to this or that individual? Well, there's really only one person whose personal experiences I know about, and that's me. So if you will kindly indulge me, I'd like to say something about how I personally experienced Wabash in the late 1960s. By this I mean 2 things sort of mixed together. My personal experience of the common experiences that I just described, and then personal experiences which, as far as I know, were, well, you could say specifically Blixonian. First, a word of caution. Obviously, all this was a good many years ago, and if I were to compose this talk in a month's time, I might well remember other things. These are the things I remember this week. I also think it's important to resist 2 extremes in recalling experiences like these. One extreme is to romanticize these experiences, to recall them through scarlet-colored glasses, if you will, to say how great they were, and to sigh nostalgically at the very telling of them over many a mug of beer. The other extreme is to intellectualize these experiences, to analyze them intellectually, to explain them through some theory or another. You can possibly imagine a Freudian psychoanalytic theory of, say, the pole fight, and thus to distance yourself from the experience themselves. I wish to do neither. I don't find either of these extremes helpful. The romanticizing extreme is uncritical. If you go that route, you run the risk of being self-indulgent. And the intellectual extreme is superficial. If you go that route, you run the risk of stifling the power of your imagination. So better, I think, simply to recall these experiences best one can and try to say more or less what they were like. To begin with freshman indoctrination. I actually found it to be kind of fun. It was a great game. True, I was never actually chased or tackled to the ground for my pot. But I do remember walking once past what is now the dean's house on Wabash Avenue, or at least somewhere near it. At least I remember that there was an wrought iron fence. On the one side was a group of upperclassmen playing a vigorous game of touch football. On the other side was me, wearing my pot and walking humbly along the sidewalk, hoping not to be seen. As I walked past, an upperclassman suddenly reached over the fence and seized my pot. Instinctively, and without thinking about it, I reached back across the fence and seized the pot out of his hand and slapped it back on my head and kept walking. I then glanced back, thinking he might be chasing me. But he wasn't. He looked stunned and then broke into a smile. Hot damn, I thought. Well, not really, since at the time I didn't use words like damn, but that was the feeling. What about the pole fight? You will remember that I said I was a nerd. This meant, among other things, that I was very skinny and had no athletic ability whatsoever. The good thing about being a nerd is that you learn to make your nerdiness work for you. Now, I could not imagine taking part in the pole fight, and I could not even begin to imagine what possible good I could do if I did. So, during the pole fight, I stood up on the railroad tracks, safely out of harm's way, and watched it from a safe distance. What about chapel sing? Not a problem. I learned the songs cold. I still remember where I stood in front of the chapel both times, staring fixedly at the top of the flagpole at the other end of the mall. Some upperclassmen did haze me, shouting and yelling, but I was unshakable. No W haircut for me. I should add, as an antidote to romanticizing, that there were a couple of fellows in our year who did get the W haircut. They found the experience humiliating, and they subsequently left the college. Not good, I think. There were, of course, other non-academic experiences. I recall how in my freshman year I returned for the second semester and went over to the library to register for classes. That's where we did it in those days. As I came in the door, I was approached by Bob Mitchum, who was the director of the Glee Club. I knew him because I played in the band. I played the bassoon in the marching band. Nerd. He asked if he could have a word. I stopped where I was and then realized with great nervousness that I was standing directly on top of the college seal. I thought, dear God, I'm going to die. But he didn't notice. He said, David, the Glee Club is going to Europe this summer. We have a few extra slots. Would you like to join the Glee Club and come along? Of course, I stammered. So I joined the Glee Club and went to Europe in the summer of 1967, and somewhere along the line, learned how to sing. Or again in my senior year, there was the invasion of Cambodia and the shooting of the students at Kent State. which darkened our days. And also in the spring of our senior year, there was an event or happening on campus called Ralph's Mother. Ralph's mother was named after the campus cop, which we had in those days, who was named Ralph. It was as near to a hippie event, I suppose, that this campus ever had. The poet Allen Ginsberg came to Wabash and chanted poetry from the steps of Waugh Hall, which was where the biology department was, and that building used to stand where Hayes Hall now is. An amazing experience. What about my personal experiences of the common academic stuff of the day? Well, I like languages, so the foreign language requirement was not a problem. I took 2 years of French, and then for fun, 2 years of Russian. Russian was taught by the late, great Peter Sillins, who would clap his hand to his head when you made a mistake and say, "Боже мой, господин Blix, Боже мой," which translates roughly as, "My God, Blix, oh my God." And French I learned in a remarkable course devised by Richard Strawn, now a professor emeritus and living in happy retirement in Crawfordsville. I would guess that it was one of the first oral language courses in the country which made abundant use of the language lab. I still recall to this day the extraordinary experience of working in the language lab and gradually seeing sense and meaning emerge out of these sounds. There were evenings when I would return to Martindale Hall after being in the lab and be filled with a kind of linguistic ecstasy. It was like a religious experience. And then there were general biology and phys chem. I admit that I was terrified of these courses. For one thing, I was a humanities kind of guy and felt that science was not my strong point. Besides, the faculty in Division I had a fearsome reputation. The late Willis Johnson, who was chair of the bio department, presided over the course, and he had a long pointer which he used to hurl at sleeping students like a Roman javelin. The late Ed Hainish, who was chair of the chemistry department, could be heard up and down the corridors of Goodrich Hall, which is where chemistry was then, bellowing, "Moles, gentlemen, moles!" And he was a large mensch. But I took both courses and I loved them, both of them. I took bio in my sophomore year, phys chem in my junior year. I should add, if I may, that there was the option, if you weren't a science major, of taking regular phys chem instead of phys chem for poets, taking regular phys chem pass-fail. Pass-fail. So that's what I did. And I attended the lectures at 7:50 in the morning on Tuesday, Thursday, and Saturday. My first semester, my lab instructor was John Zimmerman. I still vividly recall working on a problem which involved pulling weights up inclines. And I suddenly had the insight that I could take that picture and translate it into mathematical terms, and thus get rid of the picture altogether. I didn't need the picture to solve the problem. That is, I had an elementary insight into the act of abstracting from the particular to the general. Now, in retrospect, this seems almost trivial, but at the time, it was like a flash of divine light. And I still recall saying to Dr. Z, "Gee, could I do it this way?" And he looked at me and smiled and said, "Yes, that's exactly how I'd do it." And I think I grew a foot that day. Somewhere in the middle of all of this, I took my first religion course. I think it was New Testament with Raymond Williams. I was taken with his erudition and wit, and I learned a lot, and I was hooked. So I took more courses, both in religion and philosophy, and became a religion major. Indeed, if I remember correctly, I was among one of the first sizable classes of majors at the college. These courses were glorious. In my senior year, I remember taking Religion 103 and 104, or Religion 3 and Religion 4, as it was then, with Hall Peebles. He was a fantastic lecturer who opened up to us the mysteries and the beauties of world religions. Or again, I remember taking a philosophy course one fall during which we read Friedrich Nietzsche. I think the book was Beyond Good and Evil. And I remember vividly one afternoon as I was reading the book, I got so excited by it that I got up and started dancing around my room in Wolcott. Well, dancing, bouncing, thing. And from there, I danced or bounced out of the dorm, down to the Scarlet Inn. And I danced and bounced up to the counter, and I celebrated by getting a milkshake. I remember that as if it were yesterday. And the memory remains with me as one good model of the very best that can happen to students at this college. I remember these professors as giants in the earth, and I continue to think that if I and my teaching can measure up to even a fraction of what they were, I will perhaps have begun to learn how to teach. My gratitude to them is deep. Let me finish with one last story. This too is about my freshman year. In the late 1960s, the college had instituted a new honors course called Freshman Humanities. In retrospect, it turned out to be a precursor of what later became freshman tutorials. Anyway, we were assigned a book to read before we came to the first class. If I remember correctly, it was a book by the French philosopher Jean-Paul Sartre. It was called Existentialism and Human Emotions. Now, from my vantage point as a teacher today, I probably would not recommend this as a first book to ask freshmen to read in college. I recall sitting in the Lilly Library reading it just before classes started. I read it, and I read it again, and I had no idea what the hell it was about. I struggled. Anyway, I glanced up, and there across the way, sitting in another chair, was another student reading the same book. Aha, I thought, a fellow sufferer. At the same moment, he saw me. He got up out of his chair and came over. He smiled and said, "Isn't this the dumbest thing you've ever read in your life?" And my face brightened, I laughed and nodded. And then he stuck out his hand and introduced himself. "Hi," he said. "My name is Bill Plaker." From that day forward, we became friends. And that friendship has lasted for 40 years. And for that, too, I am grateful. Well, there's the deluge of stories, gentlemen. I might tell others on some other occasion, but let us now stop. That was then. That was life for me and my classmates. But this is now. This is your time. Please feel free to learn from the past, but also feel free to make your own present. That is, please feel and be free as you feel it. For if that was then, this is now. You have the freedom to make your own experiences in your own way in this great, good place, which we call Wabash College.